DAF Lamed Tes Amud Aleph. We're at the 2 dots. And we're learning about different minhagim about reciting Hallel. Remember we talked about this idea that in Kapitel Kuf Yud Ches, which is the second part of Hallel, the opening part, the first half of the kapitel, of the paragraph, has sentences that thematically are repetitious. So usually either 2 or 3 psukim in a row repeat the same theme. So that's how they're developed a minhag that for the sake of symmetry, the last half of the kapitel, which has discrete psukim that are not repetitious, we double the recital of each pasuk. That's how that minhag got started, so to sort of create that doubling throughout the psalm. So that's why the Mishnah had said, Makom shenagu lichbol yichbol, that if you live in a place where that's the minhag, you should double the psukim at the end of Hallel, which is what we do. So Tana Rebbe Kaifel Badvarim, Rebbe Lazar ben Prata Mosif Badvarim. The Brisa says that Rebbe at the end of Hallel used to double the sentences, and Rebbe Lazar ben Prata would add to the sentences. Now, what does that statement mean? That's what the Gemara asks. My Mosif, Amar Abaye Mosif Lichbol Me'odecha Ulamata. All it means is that he agrees with Rebbe that you have to double the psukim at the end of that psalm. However, Rebbe started from a later point in the psalm, and Rebbe Lazar ben Prata added by going a little bit earlier in the psalm and doubling the psukim. So Rebbe started from, like Rashi says, from Ana Hashem Hoshiana, and everything before then was a single sentence. He didn't double the sentences. But Rebbe Lazar ben Prata started doubling the sentences from Odcha Hashem Ki Ani Son, which is the way we do it. That's the way it's printed in our siddur. Okay, that's our minhag. Okay, and the Mishnah had also said wherever there's a minhag to be mevarech, yivarech, and wherever there's a minhag not to make a bracha on Hallel, you don't make a bracha on Hallel. So Amar Abaye lo shanu elo la'acharav afalofanav mitzvah levarech. Abaye says this is only true as far as there being different minhagim on making a bracha on Hallel, only as far as the ending of Hallel is concerned. But as far as the opening bracha of Hallel, once there's a halacha that you must recite Hallel, you always have to make a bracha, because you always have to make a bracha before you're going to do a mitzvah, even a rabbinic mitzvah. And once Hallel is mandated as an obligation, so you have to make a bracha on it because it's a rabbinic commandment. I want to just clarify this for just a moment. The Gemara elsewhere, I believe we saw this in Psachim. I think we see it in Megillah. I think we see it in a couple of other places. Does talk about times when Hallel is only a minhag to recite and not a mandate, not a halachic mandate. And in those instances, the Gemara talks about saying Hallel without a bracha. There was a minhag originally that on Rosh Chodesh, you said Hallel without a bracha. That was the Gemara discusses that, and I think many Sephardic communities do that as well. They say Hallel without a bracha on Rosh Chodesh, and that's why a remnant of us for that is we say half Hallel on Rosh Chodesh to remind us that it's not the same level of obligation of Hallel as on a Yom Tov, let's say, or on Chanukah, let's say. So I just want to clarify that the Gemara, when it says you always make an opening bracha on Hallel, is only talking about the halachically obligatory Hallel. Mm-hmm. So when there's a halachically obligatory Hallel, everyone agrees you make an opening bracha. There are different minhagim as to whether you make an ending bracha or not. The Gemara here is not at all addressing those times when there's only a minhag to say Hallel and not an obligation to say Hallel.
But where they say Hallel Yom Ha'atzmaut, would that be?
That's part of the dispute that's ongoing in the halachic authorities as to whether that's halachically mandated because of certain features of Yom Ha'atzmaut, or whether it's more akin to Rosh Chodesh in that it's a minhag to recite it to express thanks. Okay, but we won't go into that today. Okay, the Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, as Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Kol HaMitzvos Kulan Mevarech Alein Over La'asiyasan. As Shmuel had taught us, anytime you fulfilling a mitzvah, whether mid'oraisa or mid'orabanan, you have to make a bracha before you do the mitzvah. And therefore you have to make a bracha before you recite Hallel. Now notice the language that Shmuel uses is over la'asiyasan. Over means, in this context, before you do it. So where do you see umay mashma dahai over lishna dakdumihu? From where do we know? Why does Shmuel use that particular language of over la'asiyasan? Many times the sages use unusual words because they want to demonstrate a mastery of biblical text. So there's a lot to learn from, just like we learn from even the Sichas Chulin, even the mundane language of sages. You can learn a tremendous amount. So why did Shmuel choose this word over? There must be some biblical allusion that he is invoking. So the Omer of Nachman bar Yitzchak dichsiv, as it says, there are numerous psukim that allude to this. Vayoratz achip ma'atz derech hakikar vaya'avores hakushi. That Achim Ma'atz runs through the plain, and he runs in front of the Cushite. So, Vaya'avor means running in front of. That's a narrative of what was going on over there. So that's where you see the word Vaya'avor, or over, means in front of, or before. Abaya Omar Mehacha, V'hu Avar Lifnehem. Abaya says we have another pasuk when it comes to Yaakov Avinu, bowing before Esav. It says that he passed in front of the others in his camp in order to bow down to Esav. And there's another pasuk, alternatively, Vayavor Malkam Lifnehem Vashem Berosham, that their king passed before them, or does pass before in front of them, and Hashem is at the front. So all of these psukim use the word Vayavor to imply in front of or before, and that's how we know that a bracha is in front of the Hallel, and that is universally agreed upon. Let's go on to the Mishnah. Halokeach lulav mechaveru bashvius, no sein lo esrog b'matana, lefi she'ein rashai lo kcho bashvius. One line statement of the Mishnah is that if you're purchasing a lulav from your friend, here Rashi comes in and says that we have to change the girsa. You're not buying a lulav from your friend, you're buying a lulav from an am ha'aretz. And usually in Mishnaic terminology, the word chaver implies a knowledgeable friend. And Am Haaretz implies an illiterate friend who may not be so meticulous in observance. And that's really what we're talking about here. You're buying a lulav in esrog from a guy who's a merchant. He's Shomer Shabbos, no question, but he's not, he cuts corners once in a while because he's not so literate about all of the halachas. That's what an Am Haaretz is. And our concern is that you're buying it from him during the Shemitah year, and therefore it'll be upcoming this coming Sukkot, which is the Shemitah year, and our concern is he's going to be selling you Shemitah produce, and we're worried that the esrog is going to be a Shemitah esrog, and therefore you have a problem. While it's perfectly legal for him to sell you that esrog from a Shemitah harvest, there are certain rules that apply. Any money that he takes in for selling Shemitah produce has Kedushas Shvius. It has the sanctity of Shemitah, and as a result, he can only use it in the same way that he would use Shemitah produce. Shemitah produce has to be consumed during the Shemitah year and cannot be kept over past the Shemitah year. Therefore, the proceeds, the cash proceeds of Shemitah produce have to be consumed during the Shemitah year in order to buy stuff, right? In order to buy consumables. Those things have to be consumed over the course of the year, and you cannot put that money in a long-term CD. You got to get rid of that money right away. During
consumables, is that food?
Food.
Not clothing.
I don't believe clothing would apply because clothing extends past the Shemitah year. All right. So therefore, our concern is he's going to misuse the money, which is going to have Kedushas Shemitah on it, and therefore you have to tell him when you buy the esrog from him, listen, my dear friend, you don't want to call him an Am Haaretz, that would be an insult. Say, my dear friend, I'd like you to do me a favor. Give me the esrog for free, and I'll just pay you for the lulav, the aravos, and the hadassim. Okay? And those, for whatever reason, we're not worried about Shemitah. We'll explain why we're not worried about Shemitah on those items. We're only worried about the esrog being a Shemitah esrog. We'll explain.
You could pay him in kind as well. You could give him food for the esrog.
You could, but here you're paying him cash, and therefore you have to arrange for him that he's going to give you the esrog as a gift for free, because you can't purchase it from him on Shemitah out of a fear that he's going to misuse the money. So the Gemara now says, Lo ratza litein lo b'matana mahu. Well, what if the Am Haaretz says, no, thank you, I'm not going to give you it for free. I'm entitled to make a profit off of this esrog, so what should you do? So Amar Rav Huna, mavliya le dimei esrog belulav, period. Very simple. What you do is that you inflate the price of the lulav in order to have him give you the esrog free. So if he says, so you say to him, how much is the full set? He says $100. Okay, I'll give you $100 for those 3 if you give me the esrog for free. He'll look at you like you're Meshuggah, right? But as long as you do that, then it's okay. All right? So the Gemara says, V'leisav lei behedja. What's wrong with paying for the esrog outright? Lafisha ein mosrin demei perush shvias la'am haaretz, because you're not allowed to give cash for Shemitah produce to an am haaretz, because we fear that he's going to misuse it. The Tanya, as the Brisa says, ein mosrin demei perush shvias la'am haaretz yoser mimazon shalosh seudos, that you're not allowed to give him more than the value of 3 meals that we assume he's going to consume right away, because if you give him more than that, we're worried that he's going to put it into a savings account instead of treating it with the kedusha of shvius, which has to be consumed immediately. Now the Brisa continues and it says, V'im Mosar, what happens if b'di'evid you forgot the halacha? You gave the guy $100 for the esrog. What is the rectification? What should you do if you purchase perush shvius from an am haaretz and now he's got the cash in hand? So Yomar Haremos Halalu Yehu Mechulalan Al Perush Yesh Lebesot Basi. What you should do is you should say as follows: oh yeah, I made a terrible mistake, so b'di'evid, how can I fix it? Okay, the money, the $100 that I gave that guy, I want the kedusha of that money to be transferred onto $100 worth of produce, let's say grain that's in my granary, and then uba va'ochlan b'kedusha shvius. And then when you get home, you have to treat that grain with the kedusha of Shemitah, which means consume it within the Shemitah year. Okay? So now the Gemara says, Bamedvar mamurim belokeach min hamufkar. The Brisa then clarifies further, and it says, when we say that you're permitted to purchase produce from an am haaretz, as long as it's less than the amount of 3 meals, that's only when the am haaretz has treated his produce as hefker. However, if he has not treated it as hefker, but rather has protected and created a barrier around it, then you can't even give him a penny. You can't give him any money at all. So let's just clarify what we mean over here. Another rule when it comes to Shemitah year is that the Torah says that all produce that is growing in your property, on your orchard, has a din of hefker, which means it's available to the animals that can come out, they can eat whatever they want. You have to remove all of the locks in your fences and let anyone come in onto your property and take whatever they want. That's one of the rules of Shemitah. There's no such thing as property on Shemitah year. So, if the Am Haaretz is careful enough to treat his property that way, so he's got his apple orchard, and he opens up the fencing and lets anyone come in and take apples, then we give him permission to sell his apples, provided that you don't give him more than 3 meals worth of cash. That's okay. But if he abuses the halacha to the point where he doesn't treat his orchard like hefker, he locks it off and puts big signs, no trespassing, trespassers will be shot or whatever, and he doesn't let anyone on the field, so then he's in gross violation of Shemitah, and therefore you can't even buy a penny's worth of apples from that guy because he's really not doing anything right.
But
Okay.
if this merchant is selling produce and you come and you only buy enough for 3 meals, and the next person, all buy for 3 meals, he's got way more than he needs for 3
Okay,
meals.
but here's the issue. I'm not allowed to be over on lifnei iver lo sitein michshal. I can't cause another Jew to sin. If he finds a way to accumulate enough money to put it aside, I haven't caused him to sin. I've only given him enough for 3 meals. So I'm not over on lifnei iver, you're not over on lifnei iver, he's not over on lifnei iver. If collectively we end up causing him, so there's no in one isser of lifnei iver. So that's the basis behind this halacha. Okay, so now the Gemara says, so masiv Rav Sheshes u'min hamufker gimel sudos v'sulo. So you mean to tell me that you're only allowed to give him the amount of cash worth 3 meals if he treats his field in the proper fashion? Or a minhi, I'll show you the following brisa that seems not that way. It says, Hapigam v'hayarbuzin v'hashitim v'chalaglugos v'hakusbar shebaharim v'hakarpos shebanaharos v'hagargir shel efer piturin min hamaiser. Now, these are all different kinds of herbs that grow wildly, Rashi says. They grow in the mountains, they grow by the riverbanks, they grow in the forest. They're herbs, grasses, different things you use for spices and herbs for your salad, okay? So these things are pater from meiser. You don't have to tithe them. And the reason you don't have to tithe them is because they're considered to be, they grow wildly. They grow like hefker. And anything that you take from hefker is not subject to meiser. And furthermore, v'nikachin mikol adam bashvius, lefi she'en kayotze bahem nishmar. And furthermore, you can buy them freely from anyone during the Shemitah year, even from an Am Haaretz, because you don't have to worry that anyone is going to actually put a barrier around this kind of herb because it grows wildly. The only reason we wouldn't allow you to buy from a person is if we suspected him of not treating his orchard or field properly by letting people come onto the field. But over here, since these are wildly growing anyway, there's no reason to assume that anyone would have grown these herbs in an illicit fashion during the Shemitah year. But you see from this brisa that there's no limitation as to how much of these herbs you're allowed to buy from an Amr. So the brisa doesn't qualify it by saying that you're only allowed to buy those herbs so much as giving him enough cash for 3 meals and no more. So that seems to contradict what you just said. So the Gemara answers, "Who mosiv la v'hu mefarik la." The same Rav Sheshes who asked this as a question answered it by saying, "B'chedei man shanu." You know what? I later found out that when this brisa was taught, it was qualified by saying that you're only allowed to give him enough money for his mun. The word mun over here means for his daily bread. And that actually is consistent with what we just said. You can only give him up to the amount that he needs for 1 day's worth of meals and no more. And Rabbi Yochanan said the same thing, that this price is qualified and is limited to only giving him enough money for his daily bread. Where do you see that mun, the word mun implies a daily ration of meals? Now, if I was asking this question, if someone was asking me this question, I would say, well, look in the Torah, it talks about the mun, filled daily. But the Gemara doesn't use that as the answer. I don't know why. I'll let you research this. I just don't understand why the Gemara doesn't just say, well, the mun filled daily, so that's how we know that the word mun means a daily ration. But the Gemara brings a pasuk from Daniel, strangely enough. It says, D'chsiv vayeman lahem hamelech v'goymer, that King Nebuchadnezzar gave Daniel and his other court Jews their daily ration of bread and legumes for their daily ration. So that's where you see vayaman is used in the verb form, meaning mun as a daily ration. Okay, fine. So the Gemara, maybe it's because on Shabbos the mun fell double. So maybe you would say, well, the word mun in the Torah could mean either a single portion or it could mean a double portion. I don't know. So therefore you have to go to Sefer Din. I'm not sure. So the Gemara now says, I hachi lulav nami. So the Gemara says, okay, fine. Now that you've clarified why you're not allowed to buy the esrog from an Am Haaretz, because we're fearful that he's going to store away the money in a CD, why are you allowed to buy the lulav from him? Don't you have to be concerned about a lulav having kedushas shvius, the sanctity of Shemitah? So the Gemara answers, lulav bar shishas hanichnas l'shviyasu. The answer is, when is Sukkah? Sukkah is at the very beginning of the Shemitah year. Like this coming year will be a Shemitah year. So we can assume that whenever the lulav's primary growth was not from the 1st of Tishrei to the 15th of Tishrei, but it primarily grew before Rosh Hashanah. If it primarily grew before Rosh Hashanah, then it's from the 6th year, and it has no Kedusha Shvius. And therefore there's no problem in buying the lulav from the guy, because it's not Shemitah.
What about the lulav from next year?
Good question. The Gemara is answering, we're talking about buying a lulav in year 7. We're not. Maybe Taka, you're right. Maybe in year 8, the halakha and the Mishnah
over into
sure.
Right. So, but you'll see from this discussion, you'll be able to extrapolate your issue from the following discussion. But there's a more basic question. If the lulav is considered to have grown in the 6th year, what about the esrog? So the Gemara says, "Ihachi esrog nami bashishus anichneses l'shviyasi." So the Gemara says, well, then why is esrog any different from lulav? Its primary growth happened before Rosh Hashanah. What's the big deal? It should be a 6th year esrog, not a 7th year esrog. So the Gemara answers, esrog basar lakita azlina. The answer is, the Gemara says that an esrog is different from all other produce. All other produce, when you want to determine what year it belongs to, you look at its primary growth spurt, and if its primary growth to the point where it's considered a finished fruit already is before Rosh Hashanah, so it's considered to be from the 6th year. But in Esrog, the criterion is not when its primary growth is, the criterion is when it's harvested. And since the Esrogim of the Shemitah year are in all likelihood harvested after Rosh Hashanah, that's not true in the industrial world of today. That's not true. But in the times of the Mishnah, since the esrog is in all likelihood harvested after Rosh Hashanah, so then you have to treat it with Shemitah Kedusha.
Rabbi, could it also be because the esrog tree tastes like the fruit, so even before the fruit is grown, it's already
It's an interesting idea, but that's not what the Gemara says. The question that you really need to ask is, and you're on the right track, Paul. The question really is, why should an esrog be any different from other produce?
Yeah.
So Rashi tells us because it has to do with the water source for the esrog's nourishment. And the Gemara learns out that when it comes to produce, you go after chanata, you go after its primary growth, because it is the definition of produce is that its primary nourishment, its hydration primarily comes from rain. An esrog tree's primary nourishment comes from irrigation and watering, because it's a it's a type of fruit that requires a lot of extra watering, more so than rain. And as a result, it has certain features that make it completely different from any other produce, and therefore you go according to the way it's harvested, not according to the way that it grows. So the Gemara says, okay, but wait a minute. V'ha bein Rabin Gamliel vein Rabbi Eliezer le'inyan shvius esrog basar chanata azlinan. What you just told me seems to be completely contradicted by the following Mishnah. We're going to see a machlokas between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer, but they both seem to agree that when it comes to the laws of Shemitah, you go according to its growth, not according to its harvest. Ditnan, the Mishnah says as follows. This is a Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. It's a Mishnah in Bikurim. So it says, Esrog shave le'ilan begimel derachim, u'liyerek b'derech echad. That an esrog is equivalent to a tree in 3 aspects, and it's equivalent to a vegetable in 1 aspect. And that's really why, when it comes to the watering issue, it's more equivalent to a vegetable, where by vegetables in the Shemitah year, you go according to its harvest date, not according to its growth date. So in what respects is it equivalent to a tree? Shavel ilan begimel drachim, la'orla u'laravoy v'lashvius. It's when it comes to these 3 halachos, it's just like any other tree. By the laws of orla, which means the first 3 years of the tree's growth, you can't benefit at all from the produce. That's true by an esrog tree as well. Ravoy means neta ravoy. During the 4th year of the tree's life, you're allowed to benefit from the fruit, but it has to be treated with kedusha. So you have to bring that produce up to Yerushalayim to consume it, just like Meiser Sheni. And the 3rd halacha is for Shemitah. For Shemitah, it is exactly the same as any other tree, and therefore you go according to the chanata, you go according to its primary growth, not according to its harvest like vegetables. Very clearly you see that it goes according to the growth, not according to the harvest. V'layerek b'davar echad, shvius l'kitaso isuro. B'derech echad, u'layerek b'derech echad, sorry, shabishas l'kitaso isuro, sorry. That it's analogous to vegetables in only one respect, having to do with the laws of Meiser. Now let's just establish that when it comes to Meiser, the only things that are biblically subject to Meiser are wheat and grapes, right? Other things are rabbinically subject to Meiser, vegetables and other kinds of fruits that grow on trees. So what the rabbis did is they made 2 categories. They made fruit and they made vegetables. But according to Rabbi Gamliel, esrogim, as far as Meiser are concerned, are more in the category of vegetables because of their irrigation, because of the way that they receive their water nourishment. And as a result, when it comes to Meiser, if you need to determine what year this fruit comes from, as far as Meiser, you go according to the date that it is harvested, not the date that it got its primary growth. So, because that makes it more like a vegetable, which is in the same category. But it's only vis-a-vis the laws of Meiser that we say we go according to the harvest. But according to Rabbi Gamliel, when it comes to Shemitah, it goes according to what? It goes according to its primary growth. Mm-hmm. Now, just to clarify, when we say that for Meiser it goes according to the date when it was harvested, what difference does it make what year it goes according to by the laws of Meiser? There are a few ramifications. One ramification would be is that different years of the Shemitah cycle require different types of tithing. For example, in the first, second, fourth, and fifth year of the Shemitah cycle, the secondary tithe of Meiser is called Meiser Sheni, which means you take an additional 10% after you take your first 10%, and that additional 10% is brought up to Yerushalayim and consumed. But on the third and sixth year of the Shemitah cycle, the secondary tithe is not Meiser Sheni, but rather is called what? Meiser Ani. That secondary tithe you have to give away to a poor person. So if a fruit grows primarily during year 5, but it's harvested in year 6, so then according to Rabbi Gamliel, that secondary tithe of that fruit has to go to the poor instead of being yours to take to Yerushalayim. Anyway, Rabbi Eliezer says, Esrog shava le'ilan l'chol davar, and he disagrees, and he says, no, even when it comes to tithes, it's considered a fruit, not a vegetable, and you go according to its chanata, you go according to its primary growth, not according to its date of harvest. So both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Gamliel agree that when it comes to Shemitah, it's called a fruit, you go after the chanata. So how could you possibly suggest, Gemara, that, and how could you say that the Mishnah is suggesting that when it comes to an esrog, you go according to the time of harvest and not according to the time of growth? So the Gemara answers, Hu da'amar ki haitana, because there's a third opinion in the Brisa. D'Tanya, Amar Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, Avtulmus heyed mishum chamisha zikenim, a gentleman named Avtulmus, I don't know who that is. He testified in the name of 5 elders from an earlier generation that esrog achar lakita lamaaser, that in esrog you go according to its harvest date to determine what year of the Meiser system it belongs to. And v'rabosenu nimnu be'usha v'amru bein l'maiser bein l'shvius. And our rabbis in Usha came to the consensus that that's not only true for Meiser, but we hold it's also true for Shemitah, that its harvest date determines whether it's a Shemitah produce or not. So frak the Gemara, Shvius man dochar shmei. Why did the rabbis in Usha have to discuss Shemitah if Avtulmos was only talking about Meiser? In other words, they're not responding to what he's saying. So the Gemara answers, Chisuri mechser avahachi ketani. The way you read the Bryce is like this. Esro gacha lakita l'meiser, ba'achar chanata l'shvius. That really Avtulmos' original statement was that when it comes to the laws of Meiser, the criterion is the harvest date. When it comes to the laws of Shemitah, the criterion is its primary growth. And v'rabosenu nimnu be'usha ve'amru, and our sages on that disagree, and they say, esrog achar lakita, that you follow the harvest date, bein l'maiser, bein l'shvius. It makes no difference whether it's regarding the law of Meiser, whether the law of Shemitah, but you always go according to the harvest date. And our Mishnah holds like these, Rabosenu and Usha, and that's why we say that only with the esrog is there a problem if you're buying it at the beginning of the Shemitah year, because we assume that it was harvested during the Shemitah year. But the lulav, the esra, the hadassim, and the aravos are not going to be a problem, because the lulav was harvested well before, the lulav's growth rather, it grew primarily well before Rosh Hashanah. That's its criterion, and therefore it doesn't have kedusha shvius. It's not considered a shemitah produce. And this is where we'll hold it for today. Have a wonderful Shabbos Zachar and a Freilich in Purim.